So I'm afraid I did not know Gertrude. She was gone before I came. So when I was approached about remembering in some way the life of Gertrude, I thought that perhaps we would have a separate memorial service. But when I took the idea to the Liturgy Commission, they thought it would be good, in fact, really good, to have a remembrance here at this fourth Sunday of Advent, when we would, for their reasoning was that Gertrude was the queen of the Altar Guild for many years and was fittingly remembered as we prepared to green up the church for Christmas. And that is a task to which we will apply ourselves after this service, and I hope that you will stay to do that and to have lunch, and for those of you who have remembrances of Gertrude, to share them with each other. Now, I admit I was daunted. How does one merge remembrance with the ordinary celebration of the church in a way that honors both the fourth and final Sunday of Advent and the life and legacy of a woman who was a bulwark of the church, especially given that I had never met her? Now, mercifully, Anne and David had their remembrances to share with you and to give you a picture of who she was, a woman who was always ready to step in, a character and a card, who would not hesitate to tell you the right way to do things, a woman with opinions, a woman who paved the way for women in leadership by becoming the first female lector and the first female chancellor, and I believe she was the first female vestry member. But as I thought about it, I have a simpler task, especially given the readings today. Today's gospel is one of the very few readings in the Bible which have the majority of the characters on stage as women. Young Mary, having received and accepted the responsibility and privilege of bearing the child of God, rushes off to see her much older cousin, Elizabeth, who, though thought to be barren, is pregnant with a child of her own, a child who is destined to be the great prophet foretold of old, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, the one who says, "Make straight the paths of the Lord." It's interesting to think about. We do not know why Mary turned to Elizabeth. Elizabeth had little expertise or experience to offer her. This, after all, is her first pregnancy, too. Both women were tasked with making room and welcoming the holy. I imagine that despite the disgrace of the barrenness that had gone before and the welcome of the hope of a child, the pregnancy was not without fear for Elizabeth. She spent her first 5 months in seclusion. Did she fear that the child within her womb was too good to be true? Had she conceived before and lost children to miscarriage? Did she look at her aged body and wonder whether she could survive the peril of childbirth? Mary, young and engaged, but not married, must have had a different set of fears. Luke's gospel does not say that she told Joseph of the child or of the angel's announcement. Rather, she hurries straight off to see Elizabeth and stays with her for 3 months, until about the time that Elizabeth gave birth to John. Perhaps she was worried about Joseph's response on top of bouts of morning sickness. Indeed, the possibility of being stoned for adultery must have crossed her mind. When she returns home, the child she will bear will be beginning to show, and whatever the consequences of her pregnancy will make themselves known as well. How did Elizabeth prepare for John? Did she find a crib, collect swaddling clothes, look for a midwife? In the months of seclusion, did she pray and reflect and hope against hope, seeking some sort of calm or grit or both? Did she simply decide to take it day by day? And Mary, what happened after her ringing yes to God? She goes off and she looks for the companionship of Elizabeth. What did they share of their hopes and fears, of their experience of God? Luke's gospel begins with women welcoming the good news of God's disruption in their lives. Luke's gospel begins with women making space within their lives for hope and for worship in the midst of real concern and fear. Gertrude Batts, in her own way, did the same. Week after week, she tended the small details of the worship space that we together might know God at work, God growing and moving in our midst. The polished silver and the table made ready, a great effort to make everything seem effortless. She was ready to do her part, ready to welcome others with their own parts to play. She invited children, and her presence is here with us today, not just in the stuff of worship, but in the young lives of worship as well. So I love the story of Elizabeth and Mary. I love the older Elizabeth recognizing that something marvelous is happening through the younger Mary. I love the greeting of John still in the womb. I love the great shake-up of life that happens when God moves in. And I know that although God is always doing new things, God is always doing those things in and through the legacies of what has gone before. Look around. There are those who, like Gertrude, who tend with care and preserve what is passed on to them, while being the vehicle of God's disruption and change in their own way and in their own time, as Gertrude was. That first women business, it's right up there with disruptive. Look, too, at the new faces. Who knows what God is doing in them? What is growing and waiting to be born? It is frightening to be in the midst of these things. Frightening to be in a time when what will be is not quite known. I can't help, though, but to think that it is only when Mary sees the hope being born in the older Elizabeth and the joy with which Elizabeth receives her that she can cast all her hope on the God of promise, the God of promise in the past, who will create marvelous and new things in the future, who will make God's dream come true. I can't help but think that the miracle of this story is that while everything is changed from one generation to another, nothing good is ever lost. God is faithful in the midst of it all. Faithful to our parents, to people like Gertrude, faithful to us, faithful to our children and to our children's children, which is what makes us leap for joy. And what we, with Gertrude, whom we remember today, celebrate this Sunday, now and always.